As a strength and conditioning coach, one thing that I've wondered for a while is, do band assisted jumps actually do what we think they're doing? Now, one of the things that we tend to believe is when we attach a band to a jump and we overspeed that jump, in other words, we attach the band to somewhere higher, we feed the band through our arms and we then perform a jump. The band is actually speeding up our jump and therefore we get an increase in contraction velocity. In simple terms, we're speeding up how fast our muscles can contract. So what I decided to do was have a little look into that. Now, I appreciate this is an n=1 and it's just me performing these jumps. But I performed some counter movement jumps, first at body weight, then with some very thin resistance bands to help overspeed me, and then with some slightly thicker resistance bands. Here's what happened. Now, first thing first that you can see going off the flight time of the jumps is that actually the body weight jump was the second highest. The thin resistance bands actually produced the lowest jump when measured by flight time, with the thicker resistance bands actually producing the highest jump height. Then it's a slightly different story when we look at impulse momentum. If we look at impulse momentum, we have the body weight jumps actually being on par with the thick resisted bands, and the thin resistance bands actually being significantly lower than either the body weight or the thicker resistance bands. Now, I'm not too sure actually why that is. I'm pretty well versed in jumping, and I can only put it down to the fact that jumping with such thin resistance bands actually just felt a bit off. Like, it changed my jump mechanics so much that it just felt really unusual to try and jump with such a small overspeed contribution. And if anything, I think it actually just impacted my technique a lot more than I thought it did. Then we come into the really interesting part, which is the contraction velocity. This is the whole reason why people preach the use of band assisted jumps. Now, if we actually look at concentric peak velocity, in other words, the fastest speed that I was moving at any one time during these jumps, you can actually see that the body weight jumps are on par with the thick band assisted jumps, whereas the thin band, actually the peak velocity was much lower. But when we come to look at the concentric mean velocity, in other words, the average speed across all of the jumps, we actually see that the contraction velocity or the concentric velocity of the bodyweight jump was actually higher than both the band assisted jumps, even when it came to the much thicker resistance band. Now, again, I purely put that down to probably a change in jump mechanics, even though I am, I would say, pretty well versed in jumping and have actually done a lot of band assisted jumps in my time. Even attaching those bands, I think probably changes my jump strategy enough that it really begins to decelerate me as opposed to accelerate me. So what does all this mean? Most importantly, we're interested in the concentric peak and mean velocity, because that is the whole rationale as to why we would use bands in the first place. Now, I appreciate, again, this is only me and this is an experiment only on myself, but you can really see from the data here that the thought process of that the band actually speeds up our concentric phase during the jumps doesn't really reign true. If anything, the data that I've got here just on me shows that a bodyweight jump is actually performed at a similar peak velocity, but a higher mean velocity than band assisted jumps.